The wailing of a hungry infant pierced the quiet Montana night like a knife, echoing off the walls of Jane Anderson's small cabin as she paced the rough wooden floor, bouncing her 3-month-old daughter in her arms. Tears streamed down Jane's hollow cheeks, her once vibrant green eyes now dull with exhaustion and worry. It had been 2 days since her cow had died, 2 days of watching her baby girl grow weaker with hunger, her tiny face red and contorted with the pain of an empty stomach. "Hush now, my sweet Lily," Jane whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, just a little longer." The year was 1876, and winter had come early to Willow Creek. Jane's husband had died in a mining accident just before Lily was born, leaving her alone with a newborn and few resources. She'd managed well enough through summer and early fall, but now, with her milk cow dead from some mysterious illness and the nearest town 15 miles away, desperation clawed at her heart. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the shutters Jane had carefully hung just last month. She glanced at the window, her breath catching at the sight of snow beginning to fall. A storm was coming. She knew what that meant: they would be trapped, possibly for days. Lily's cries grew more frantic, her tiny fists balled against her mother's chest. Jane felt her own body failing, her breast milk having diminished to almost nothing from her own poor nutrition and stress. "God help us," she whispered, sinking into the rocking chair her husband had crafted during their first year of marriage. "Please send someone." Miles away, Grant Mitchell pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders as he urged his horse forward through the darkening evening. At 32, he'd spent most of his adult life driving cattle and breaking horses, moving from ranch to ranch across the Montana Territory. The past year he'd been working as foreman at the Rockingham Ranch, finally putting down some roots after years of drifting. "Come on, Thunder," he urged his stallion as the snow began to fall more heavily. "Just a little further to shelter." He'd been on his way back from delivering a message to a neighboring ranch when the storm had started brewing earlier than expected. Grant knew these mountains well enough to respect their dangers. A man caught in a blizzard could freeze to death within hours. As he rounded a bend in the trail, a faint sound caught his ear, carried on the wind. He reined Thunder to a stop, listening. There it was again, the unmistakable cry of a baby. Grant frowned, peering through the growing darkness. He wasn't far from the Anderson homestead, if he recalled correctly. The young widow who lived there kept to herself mostly, though folks in town spoke well of her. He'd tipped his hat to her once or twice when their paths crossed, but they'd never exchanged more than pleasantries. The crying grew louder as he guided Thunder toward the sound. Soon a small cabin came into view, a thin wisp of smoke curling from its chimney. The baby's wails were clearer now, punctuated by what sounded like a woman's soft sobbing. Grant dismounted, tying Thunder to a post, and approached the door. He knocked firmly, stomping his boots to shake off the snow. The crying paused briefly, then continued as footsteps approached the door. "Who's there?" A woman's voice called, fear evident in her tone. "Grant Mitchell, madam, foreman from the Rockingham. I was passing by and heard the little one crying. Is everything all right?" The door cracked open, revealing Jane Anderson's tear-streaked face. Her dark blonde hair hung in a loose braid over one shoulder, and she clutched a red-faced, screaming infant to her chest. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, recognition flickering in her eyes. "I were managing." Grant took in her appearance, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her dress hung loosely on her frame, the tremble in her hands. The cabin behind her was neat but sparse, the fire in the hearth burning low. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Anderson, but you don't look to be managing too well," he said gently. "Is there something I can help with?" Jane's composure crumbled. "My milk cow died 2 days ago," she confessed, her voice breaking. "Lily's hungry, and I don't have enough milk for her myself anymore. I was going to try to get to town tomorrow, but now with the storm." Grant understood immediately. Without cow's milk to supplement her own, the baby would only grow weaker. And with a blizzard setting in, she couldn't possibly make the journey to town. "May I come in, madam? It's getting mighty cold out here." Jane hesitated only briefly before stepping back. "Of course." Inside, the cabin was warm but simple, a table with 2 chairs, a small bed in one corner with a cradle beside it, a rocking chair near the fire. Grant removed his hat, holding it respectfully in his hands. "When did you last eat, Mrs. Anderson?" he asked, noticing the distinct lack of food preparation. "Yesterday morning," she admitted. "I've been saving what little I have for Lily." Grant's jaw tightened. He'd seen his share of hardship in the West, but a mother and infant starving alone in a cabin stirred something fierce in him. "I've got some jerky and hardtack in my saddlebags," he said, already moving toward the door. "It's not much, but it'll help you keep up your strength." "Mr. Mitchell, I couldn't possibly—" "Please call me Grant," he interrupted, retrieving his provisions. "And you most certainly can. You need to eat if you're going to care for your little one." As Jane reluctantly accepted the food, Lily's cries reached a desperate pitch. Grant watched the pain cross the young mother's face as she tried to comfort her daughter. "How far is the nearest farm with a milk cow?" he asked suddenly. Jane looked up, confusion in her eyes. "The Hendersons have a small dairy operation about 8 miles north, but in this weather, 8 miles isn't so far," Grant said, already pulling his coat back on. "I can make it there and back before the worst of the storm hits." "You can't be serious," Jane protested, rising from her chair. "It's dangerous out there and getting worse by the minute. I can't ask you to do that." Grant settled his hat back on his head, his blue eyes meeting her steadily. "You didn't ask, Mrs. Anderson. I'm offering." "Jane," she said softly. "If you're Grant, then I'm Jane." He nodded, a small smile crossing his weathered face. "Jane it is. Now, is there anything else you need while I'm making this trip?" She hesitated, then crossed to a small shelf and retrieved a tin container. "If Mr. Henderson can spare some coffee, I'd be grateful. And please tell him I'll pay him for the milk as soon as the weather clears." Grant took the tin, tucking it inside his coat. "I'll be back as soon as I can. Keep that fire going." Before Jane could protest further, he was out the door, mounting Thunder with practiced ease. As he rode away from the cabin, the baby's cries followed him, spurring him to dig his heels into his horse's flanks. The journey to the Henderson farm was treacherous. The snow fell harder with each passing minute, the wind cutting through Grant's heavy coat. Twice, Thunder nearly lost his footing on the slippery trail, but Grant guided him steadily forward, thinking of the hungry infant and her exhausted mother. When he finally reached the Henderson homestead, lights still glowed in the windows despite the late hour. Tom Henderson answered Grant's knock, surprise evident on his face. "Mitchell, what in blazes are you doing out in this weather?" Grant quickly explained the situation, watching understanding dawn on the older man's face. "The Anderson widow, poor thing, lost her husband right before the baby came, didn't she?" Henderson turned, calling to his wife. "Martha, bring some milk and whatever food we can spare." Within minutes, Grant found himself facing a dilemma. The Hendersons had generously provided a container of milk, but it wouldn't last long. What Jane and Lily needed was a steady supply. "Tom," Grant said slowly, "would you consider selling one of your milk cows? I'll pay full price." Henderson looked surprised. "In this weather, how would you get it back to the Anderson place? I'll manage," Grant said firmly, reaching for his money pouch. "Do we have a deal?" An hour later, Grant was leading Thunder back through the worsening storm, a rope in his hand connected to a gentle Jersey cow the Hendersons had sold him. The saddlebags across Thunder's back were now filled with provisions: milk, bread, dried meat, and vegetables from the Hendersons' root cellar. Martha Henderson had insisted on sending along a small jar of honey, and some of her preserves as well. The journey back took twice as long, the cow moving cautiously through the deepening snow. Grant's fingers and toes grew numb with cold, but he pressed on, guided by the thought of Jane's grateful face when he returned. It was well past midnight when the cabin finally came into view, a single lantern still burning in the window. Grant led the animals to the small lean-to shelter attached to the cabin that had once housed Jane's cow, making sure they were protected from the worst of the storm before approaching the door. His knock was answered immediately, as if Jane had been waiting just on the other side. When she opened the door, her eyes widened at the sight of him, covered in snow and stamping his boots. "You came back," she breathed, relief washing over her face. "I said I would," Grant replied simply, reaching into his coat to produce the container of milk. "This should help for tonight." Jane took it with trembling hands, tears springing to her eyes. "Thank you. I don't know how I can ever repay. There's more," Grant interrupted, gesturing toward the lean-to. "I brought provisions that should last a while and a more permanent solution to your problem." Jane's confusion was evident as she moved to look past him, Lily still fussing in her arms. When she saw the cow, a small gasp escaped her lips. "You brought a cow? In this storm?" Grant shrugged, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "The little one needs milk." This seemed the most sensible solution. Jane stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to Grant's surprise, she began to laugh, a bright, relieved sound that made something warm unfurl in his chest. "Mr. Mitchell Grant, you are the most remarkable man I've ever met," she said, wiping away tears that were now from joy rather than despair. "Please, come inside and warm yourself while I feed Lily." The cabin seemed different when Grant re-entered, brighter somehow, despite the late hour. He built up the fire while Jane warmed some of the milk and fed it to Lily with a small spoon, the baby's cries finally subsiding as her hunger was sated. "She's beautiful," Grant commented, watching the infant's tiny hands curl around her mother's finger. "She's all I have," Jane said softly, looking down at her daughter with such love that it made Grant's heart ache. "I was so afraid tonight. I didn't know what I was going to do." "You're not alone anymore," Grant said, the words coming out before he could consider them. "I mean, the town looks after its own. You should have sent word that you were in trouble." Jane's smile was sad. "Pride, I suppose. After Thomas died, I was determined to prove I could manage on my own. Foolish in retrospect." "Not foolish," Grant countered. "Brave." They fell into easy conversation as the night deepened, the storm howling outside while they remained safe and warm within. Grant told Jane about his years of drifting, working cattle drives from Texas to Montana, before finally settling at the Rockingham. Jane shared stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her journey west with Thomas following their wedding, and their dreams for the homestead that she now tended alone. As dawn approached, Lily slept peacefully in her cradle, and Jane insisted that Grant take her bed while she dozed in the rocking chair. "I can't put you out of your bed, Jane," he protested. "You rode 16 miles through a blizzard with a cow in tow to save my daughter," she replied firmly. "The least I can do is let you rest properly before you have to head back to your ranch." Grant wanted to argue, but exhaustion won out. He removed his boots and stretched out on the narrow bed, falling asleep to the gentle sound of Jane's breathing nearby. He woke hours later to the smell of coffee and something cooking. The storm had passed, bright sunshine streaming through the windows. Jane stood at the small stove, Lily securely wrapped against her chest as she stirred a pot. "Good morning," she said, noticing he was awake. "I hope you're hungry." "I'm making a proper thank you breakfast with some of the provisions you brought." Grant sat up, running a hand through his hair. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," Jane replied simply. They ate together at the small table, Lily occasionally making contented noises from her cradle. Grant found himself reluctant to leave, even though he knew he should return to the ranch to report his whereabouts. "I should check on the animals and be on my way," he said finally, setting down his coffee cup. Jane nodded, though he thought he detected a flash of disappointment in her eyes. "Of course. You've already done far more than anyone could have expected." Outside, Grant fed and watered both Thunder and the cow, who seemed to have settled well into her new home. When he returned to the cabin, Jane was waiting with a small package wrapped in cloth. "Biscuits for your journey," she explained, pressing them into his hands. "It's not much, but it's perfect," Grant assured her. He hesitated, then added, I'd like to check on you and Lily in a few days if that's all right. Make sure the cow is working out for you." The smile that lit Jane's face was worth every frozen mile he'd traveled the night before. "We'd like that very much." As Grant rode away from the cabin, he found himself already counting the days until he could return. Something had changed in him during that long night. A drifting man had found a reason to stay rooted. True to his word, Grant returned to Jane's homestead 3 days later, and then again the following week. Each visit lasted longer than the one before, as they found more to talk about, more reasons to linger in each other's company. He fixed the loose boards on her porch. She mended the tear in his favorite shirt. He brought books from town that they read aloud by the fire in the evenings. She baked bread that filled the cabin with a scent that reminded him of a home he'd never really had. Lily grew stronger with each passing day, her cheeks filling out, her cries becoming less frequent and more often replaced by coos and giggles. She seemed especially delighted by Grant's deep voice, often staring at him in fascination when he spoke. "She likes you," Jane remarked one evening in late November as Grant held the infant carefully in his large hands. "The feeling's mutual," he replied, gently bouncing Lily until she rewarded him with a toothless smile. As winter settled fully over the Montana landscape, Grant found himself spending more time at the Anderson homestead than at his own quarters at the Rockingham. His boss, understanding the situation, adjusted Grant's duties to allow him more flexibility. With a knowing look that made Grant's ears turn red, by Christmas, the people of Willow Creek were beginning to talk. The handsome ranch foreman and the young widow were the subject of much speculation, and mostly good-natured gossip. When Grant escorted Jane and Lily to the town's Christmas celebration, the smiles and nods that greeted them confirmed what everyone already suspected: they had become a family in all but name. After the new year, as they sat before the fire one snowy evening, Lily asleep in her cradle, Grant finally found the courage to speak the words that had been building in his heart for months. "Jane," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I've been thinking a lot about the future lately." She looked up from her sewing, something in his tone catching her attention. "Oh," Grant moved from his chair to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his. "I never thought I'd find a place that felt like home or people who felt like family. But I have with you and Lily." Jane's eyes widened, her needle and thread forgotten in her lap. "I love you, Jane Anderson," Grant continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I love your strength, your kindness, your determination. I love the way you care for Lily, the way you've opened your home and heart to me, and if you'll have me, I'd like to build a life with you, both of you." Tears welled in Jane's eyes as she squeezed his hands. "The night you came through that blizzard with a cow in tow, I thought you were some kind of miracle," she whispered. "I never imagined you'd become the answer to prayers. I hadn't even thought to pray." "Is that a yes?" Grant asked, his heart pounding. Instead of answering, Jane leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that spoke more clearly than words ever could. They were married in the spring of 1877, with Lily, now toddling and babbling, serving as their flower girl with help from Martha Henderson. The small church in Willow Creek was filled to capacity as the community gathered to celebrate the union that had begun on a desperate snowy night. As they exchanged vows, Grant made promises not just to Jane but to Lily as well, pledging to be the father she deserved, to guide and protect her always. There wasn't a dry eye in the church when he lifted the little girl into his arms after the ceremony, officially becoming the family they had been in their hearts for months. Life on the homestead flourished under their combined efforts. Grant left his position at the Rockingham to work their land full-time, expanding their herd to include not just dairy cows but beef cattle as well. Jane's vegetable garden thrived, providing enough produce to sell the excess in town. In the spring of 1878, Jane gave birth to a son they named Thomas Grant Mitchell, in honor of both her first husband and the man who had saved her during her darkest hour. Lily, now 2 years old, took to her role as big sister with enthusiasm, constantly wanting to help her baby, as she called her brother. As their family grew, so did their homestead. Grant built additions to the cabin, transforming it into a proper farmhouse with enough room for their expanding family. He never forgot, though, the original cabin where he'd first fallen in love with Jane and Lily. 5 years after that fateful night, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching Lily, now a spirited 5-year-old, chase fireflies in the yard with her 3-year-old brother and their newest addition, 1-year-old Emma. You ever think about how different things might have been? Jane asked, her head resting on Grant's shoulder. If you hadn't passed by that night, Grant tightened his arm around her waist, remembering the desperate cries that had drawn him to her door. I think some things are meant to be, he said simply. I was always meant to find you. Jane smiled, watching their children play in the twilight. A hungry baby, a desperate mother, and a cowboy with a heart big enough to ride through a blizzard with a cow, she mused. Not exactly the romantic tale most girls dream of. Maybe not, Grant agreed with a chuckle. But it's ours, and I wouldn't change a single moment of it. As the stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky, Grant Mitchell looked at the family he'd found when he least expected it. From the moment he'd heard Lily's cries on that snowy night, his life had changed course, leading him not to another temporary job or another town to drift through, but home to Jane, to their children, to the love he'd never thought to find. The Jersey cow that had made that treacherous journey still grazed contentedly in their pasture, now accompanied by several offspring. Grant often joked that she was the most important matchmaker in Montana territory. In the years that followed, their homestead became one of the most prosperous in the region. Lily grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's determination and her adoptive father's kind heart. Thomas and Emma thrived under the love of their parents, and 2 more Mitchell children eventually joined the family. Grant and Jane never forgot how their story began with a baby's cry, a mother's desperation, and a cowboy's determination to help a stranger in need. They told the tale to their children and later their grandchildren, a reminder that love often arrives in the most unexpected ways, sometimes accompanied by a cow in a blizzard. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howled around their sturdy farmhouse, Grant and Jane would exchange a special look across the room, remembering the night that had brought them together, and the life they had built from that moment of crisis. A life filled with love, family, and the deep conviction that sometimes the longest journeys lead exactly where we're meant to be.